Greetings, welcome to the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel. I'm Salvador Cordova, and today we're joined by Cindi Lincoln, who some know as Kent Hovind's ex-wife, but we're not going to talk about that pretty much today. In today's show, I wanted to advocate for teaching creationism the right way. One reason that I have been supportive of Cindi is that, first of all, ever since I knew Kent Hovind, I did not like the way he taught creationism. And I had some questions about, what he was teaching and the way he was teaching it. And that's where I left it. And I wasn't touching at all anything of his personal life or professional life. But it did not bode well that, one, his science wasn't very good. I didn't like his debates. I felt they were not very substantive. They're good theatrics, absolutely fabulous theatrics, but the substance wasn't there. And some of the things said I don't think were just accurate. They're probably, a lot of the ideas were they were faulty, and he may have misstated some things totally incorrect. And so I really didn't follow that. I just said, guys, just don't go to him for your resources. If you want to learn about Christian creationism, there are other sources that are much more credible and much more defensible. But in light of him going to jail once and then being convicted this year of domestic violence, I finally began to look into this more. And I think there is enough credible evidence with what little I've surveyed to be seriously concerned about Christians continuing to be a following around him. when there's such more excellent sources and people, and I'm not saying me necessarily, although I'd be welcoming of more subscribers, but there are people like Rob Stadler, who's an MIT, Harvard-trained creationist, and also an excellent scientist. He holds 120 patents. Millions of people are alive today because of his invention. He invented heart devices that are implanted in millions of people today. They're alive and thriving because of his invention. He is a great role model as a Christian, as a scientist, as an author. He's written at least 2 books that I know of, and he's appeared on this channel. He co-authored the book Stairway to Life with Dr. Change Laura Tan, who, by the way, is also an excellent creationist. She's a professor of molecular biology at a secular university. These are the sort of Christians that I feel are a better role model and also a better resource than Kent Hovind. So, I think what Kent has going for him is the charisma and theatrics, but that is not science. And to the extent that he says things that are very questionable and outrightly wrong, that needs to be corrected. Another gentleman that I highly look up to and who I had the privilege of working for and still working with to this day, Dr. John C. Sanford, who's a famous geneticist. In fact, so famous and accomplished was John Sanford that his invention is in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Now, the Smithsonian Museum is something that's congressionally authorized. That's at least my understanding anyway. And his invention, Dr. Sanford's invention, the gene gun, made possible the feeding of starving millions, because through the process of improving the genes of various organisms, people are able to eat. Millions of people have been fed, billions probably at this point, because of his invention. He also pioneered the theory of genetic entropy, and it's a theory that strengthened my conviction that the young earth model, the literal interpretation of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, is supported by at least some evidence, and I believe that body of evidence continues to grow. So Cindi here had taught at Dinosaur Adventureland, and I expressed, when I reached out to her, I said, well, I wasn't drawn into criticizing Kent because of some of the things outside of his science. It was his science, and I would like to review that the way that he taught it, and maybe that Cindi and I can kind of sharpen each other's understanding in the way we communicate creationism by having this dialogue. So Cindi, please feel free to introduce yourself to everyone.
Hi, everyone. So I just want to make sure that anything I taught at my Science Center tour, which is still on the internet, isn't wrong. And I'm grateful that Sal has taken the opportunity or time to make sure that we're not teaching anything wrong.
Well, what I was thinking of doing is I'm just going to ask some questions, and we agreed before we started recording this show that maybe there's no way we could fit this sort of discussion in one segment. So this is just an opening segment to get acquainted with our understanding of science and the way creationism is taught. Now, I will say this, that I'm also involved in the intelligent design movement, which is strictly speaking different than young earth creationism or young cosmos creationism. So Cindi, have you taught anything about intelligent design, or did Kent? Maybe
I was just watching a YouTube about that last night, and I'm not really sure about how to respond about that. The one thing that we do teach is irreducible complexity. That's for sure.
Okay, let me get some.
And like symmetry and design in nature, like how things are found in hexagons and pentagons and
Hmm.
just
Okay.
like your specialty is the cell,
Yes.
for heaven's sake.
Well, let me.
That requires a designer.
Yes. I'm going to pause the video just briefly, the recording briefly. I'm going to grab some paper. And when I'm back, we'll continue. Okay, I'm back. So no, this is good. There is that we can probably do a show on the distinction between intelligent design and creationism. There's an important distinction. If one is a creationist, one automatically believes in intelligent design, but there are people that believe in intelligent design who are not creationists. So let me define the way I view creationism. Creationism, Christian creationism, and their varieties. We have old earth and young earth creationism. The old earth actually has even varieties within the old earth. There are what they call progressive creationists. Stephen Meyer could be categorized as a progressive creationist. There's kind of an old earth creationist. I'm not very familiar with the model in Hugh Ross. And then there are the young earth creationists, but then even within that, there are varieties. But fundamentally, the idea is a miraculous process was involved in the creation of life. The young earth creationists believed that the miraculous event happened less than 10,000 years ago over 6 days. The old earth creationists have a variety of models, and I'm not really that familiar with it. Is that sort of how you understand? Did you get taught any old earth creationism to compare it with young earth, or?
Well, we had a book on called The Gap Theory, and I'm familiar with old earth creationism being called theistic evolution.
Okay.
And I listened to, I believe his name was Francis Collins last night, and he seems like a Christian, but he believes in millions of years and that you can fit that into Genesis somehow. And somebody asked him at the end of the presentation, well, what about death? Doesn't it say that death didn't come till Adam? And that's always been my contention. That takes away the cross. If you take away, yeah.
This is really very informative because there are actually distinctions between the old earth creationists and theistic evolutionists. And there are all sorts of varieties in that. So this is probably, okay, this is really good to know. Maybe we could do a show then just to specifically talk about these varieties so we can get the terminology down, because they're important distinctions, and they're people probably on our side generally, even though they're not young earth creationists, they're very helpful. So you mentioned the term irreducible complexity. I'm glad that young earth creationists are using that, but the one who actually formulated the idea, who coined the word, the phrase, is Michael Behe, and he would be considered an ID proponent, but in some sense a theistic evolutionist. But you know, the funny thing is creationists will say he's a theistic evolutionist, but evolutionists will say he's a creationist. So he kind of holds a special.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
I think we had one of his books too.
He's excellent. And the reason that the ID movement is very, very important is one, it was started by top tier academics, meaning this happened in secular universities where people that, you know, may have been nominal Christians or whatever, independent of their spiritual or religious beliefs, they just came to the conclusion that life has the features of things that are designed. So there are numerous, like if you ran across like a house of cards, you would know that, you know, well, granted cards are designed, but when you see the cards put together in a way that makes a house of cards, you know that this wasn't a random process. This was not the result of like wind blowing through, you know, through the house and you'd expect it to assemble. In fact, an atheist by the name of Fred Hoyle used the phrase intelligent design. Now, how can you be an atheist and believe intelligent design? That's an interesting topic in and of itself. but he
I
could
think
see.
I
Oh, go
think I
on.
know where you're going on this. Do you know
Yes.
what? Well,
Go
I
ahead.
won't drop the name, but somebody, well, a
Go
lot
ahead,
of
drop the
people
name.
say
It's all right.
my dad told me, well, life had to be started by intelligence from another planet. And now I'm realizing there's a lot of people who are saying that.
Yes.
And in my book, well, I'm sorry, I think that's ridiculous, but even if it were true, all it does is take the question one step farther, but it's still the same question. Well, then where did it come from before that?
Yeah.
It's the same exact question.
But the interesting thing, and it's both Francis Crick and Fred Hoyle, they had varieties of extraterrestrials. But in a way, it's conceding an important fact that it's very unlikely life could arise by itself on Earth. So they have to
Wow.
appeal to something outside of the Earth. But what we're realizing is that it's probably reasonable to say it's going to be outside of this universe. So what's fashionable now is they're invoking multiple universes, and we just happen to be the one lucky one.
I have only just started to hear that argument, and I haven't been able to wrap my mind around what in the world that might mean.
Okay, so, but the idea is basically improbability. You wouldn't, okay, the atheist who said the phrase intelligent design was Fred Hoyle. And I have some of his books floating around here. But the point is that he could see, he's the one who famously said, you can't expect a tornado to pass through a junkyard and assemble a 747 jetliner. Just unreasonable.
And I've heard atheists make fun of that, but I don't see, why would you make fun of that? Isn't that like so obvious?
Yes. And what they do is they say, well, you forget about natural selection. And evolution uses natural selection to overcome the odds. And I'll say, that's not going to work in the origin. First of all, that's not going to work in the origin of life, because for natural selection to work, something has to be alive to reproduce. It has to have inheritance in a gene. So definitely for the origin of the first life, you can't invoke natural selection. So what else do you have? Chemical law. Yeah, go on.
The other thing that the atheists are doing is they're saying, well, evolution doesn't involve abiogenesis. And so again, they're taking the crux of the matter and setting it aside. And I almost was thinking the other day of saying to them, I don't really want to discuss anything else. That's the crux.
Well, what I do, and again, because I deal with trying to teach this at the university level, I try to equip Christian creationists that are going off into science curriculum with being able to deal with arguments like that. And so I'll say, okay, let's just separate the two and say there's abiogenesis, which is the emergence of life before there's a genome, and then organic or biological evolution after the first life arose, once there's inheritance and a genome. And I said, okay, I'll grant you that. I'll give you that. In fact, a lot of people may not know this, but in Darwin's, I think his final edition of The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, his famous book, he speculates that the first biological organism was created. He actually uses the word created. But then
what?
he says, yeah, that's in The
Wait a
Origin of
minute.
Species. Okay.
The atheists haven't gotten to pull that page out yet. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be making fun of them, but wow.
Okay, we can cover that. See, so to the readers out, to the viewers today, this wasn't a scripted thing. So I'm throwing a lot of things where I don't have the citation right off the top of my head. So maybe in the next show we can cover that. So even Darwin made that distinction. Let the first life be created. Now, granted, in private letters, he said maybe it arose in some warm little pond. So he had two scenarios at least. where one, life arose in a warm little pond, but that was in a private correspondence with someone. In his official book, probably the 6th edition, he talks about the first life being created. And it was that terse. It was just maybe 1 or 2 sentences where he just says, first life created. Doesn't elaborate. So, but the thing is, what I will argue is abiogenesis would require a miracle. So for evolution to even have a chance, you need life. And if the first life is a miracle, it's still a miracle. And this is going to be a recurring theme as we study the emergence of life to like complex creatures like human beings. Every step of the way, there are going to be miracles. And at some point, it's like, well, how is that different than creationism? Now, the difference is the people who advocate naturalistic abiogenesis and evolution, they'll say there are no miracles needed. And then I will counter and say, no, you have to prove that. And I'm going to show you some things that are very problematic from basic physics, chemistry, and cellular biology, molecular biophysics, whatever. It'll fail unless you invoke miracles. And what evolutionists will do is say, well, look at the fossil record, look at all. I said, one, that doesn't prove abiogenesis, does it? That doesn't solve the problem of the first life. And it certainly doesn't solve the problem of things like the emergence of eukaryotic cells. That's a major stumbling block that they don't want to talk about. So I'll point this out. Where creationists get sucked into is the evolutionists will say, look at the fossil record. And then the creationists will come in and try to criticize their interpretation of the fossil record. I say, no, don't do that. Argue cellular biology, biochemistry. You're going to win every time, almost every time.
Well, but I must say, I was listening to a guy talking about the fossil record the other night, and he was pointing out that it's all abrupt appearance.
Yes.
It's all abrupt appearance. And he gave like 5 different, I mean, I've only heard of the Cambrian explosion, but he was talking about other things that they know, like the rapid emergence of plants, the rapid immersion of mammals, the rapid immersion of, I can't remember it all, but it's not a continuous record where it flows like they show in the cartoons of evolution from a single cell to a larger single cell to, farm, fish, I forget them all, reptile, mammal.
Who was that?
It's all distinct. The record is not contiguous, which is why Stephen Gould said punctuated at equilibrium.
Excellent. Now, when you were teaching at Dinosaur Adventureland, did you cover what you just said?
I believe so, although Kent actually argued with me about the Cambrian explosion. He said that the atheists had an answer for that, but I never bought it. But nonetheless, it dampened my teaching on it. But
well, I'll tell you the reason I argue cellular biology. It's actually easier because then you don't have to deal with all those fossils because there's so many of them.
yes, but you're a cellular biologist and I'm a geographer.
Okay. All right. Well,
I like rocks. You like microscopes.
Well,
but
okay,
God is everywhere, right?
Yes. You mentioned the emergence of plants. It's not just that. Darwin himself called it the abominable mystery or something. The emergence of flowering plants, what we call angiosperms. That's still very, very problematic. And we can get into this later when we talk about molecular phylogenies and stuff, because this is the reason it's important to at least know what these fancy terms mean. Is that's what the evolutionists will throw at you. They'll say, look at all these papers, and all these papers will have what they call molecular phylogenies. And there's a way to counter this, and it's not easy. It takes some skill. Now, I learned a little bit about this. I actually studied under some pretty good evolutionary biologists myself.
Now, wait a minute. A phylogeny is a tree, right? Those trees
Yes.
of life with the branches. Okay.
Yes.
Molecular phylogeny. That means
Phylogeny. We need to talk about that at some time. Now, this is a difficult topic because creationists actually use molecular phylogeny. Can you guess what they're trying to do with it?
say it's an orchard, not a tree.
Well, it's not just that. There has been deep interest in finding how long ago Eve, our mother Eve, lived. And so you'd actually build this like common, like ancestry.com, you have the family tree. We're trying to build, the creationists are trying to build one that goes all the way back to Eve and all the way back to Noah.
I did have a display on mitochondrial Eve.
Very good.
And I recently read that there's a one on Adam too.
Well, do you know why we trace all the way back to Noah? This is really interesting. We can have a show on that. This is,
I would love that.
okay. So we have Noah. It's correct to call it Y chromosomal Noah, not Y chromosomal Adam, but we can say mitochondrial Eve. So we can hypothetically, with some generous estimates, let's say, reconstruct all the males descended from one male, that would be Noah, but all the females descended from one female, that would be Eve. So technically we are all descended from, all the males are descended, their Y chromosomes descended from Adam, but it went specifically through Noah. Noah is the most recent common ancestor. The Noah Y chromosome is the most recent common ancestor Y chromosome for all the males. And
Now, I'm sure if you're an atheist, you're going to want proof for what you just said.
well, the funny thing is, even the atheists argue there is one female from which all of us descended. They call her mitochondrial Eve. We speculate that that was named to mock the creationist, but
It preached for us. Nanny, nanny, nanny.
it began to be comical when we began to speculate, gee, what if she lived only 6,500 years ago? Now, the proof of that is actually, it's really hard to say exactly 6,500 years ago how we could do that reconstruction. I'm not convinced that any creationist has made as good an argument as I would feel comfortable defending. But suffice to say, even the evolutionists say there has to be a Y chromosomal Adam and a mitochondrial Eve. So Y chromosomal Adam is where all the way the males, the Y chromosome comes from. And mitochondrial Eve is the woman where all of the mitochondrial DNA comes from for all humans. And it's just, we have different mechanisms for how this could be. And we can talk about that, but it's interesting.
Now, wait
Yeah.
a minute, Sal. So what you're saying is all the Y chromosome had to have an origin.
Yeah.
So essentially what you're saying is a seed.
Yeah. Now, there are different mechanisms for how this could be. And that's a technical discussion because the evolutionists have their own explanation for it. And it's actually reasonably credible. I'm not going to just say dismiss them. But again, this is now getting to the college level science. Because if we teach this to the kids and say, hey, that's proof of the real, the biblical Adam and Eve, it's more nuanced than that. And we wouldn't serve them well if we didn't give them the other side. So it's good we give them the other side of the argument so that they know when they go off to school, they're going to hear the other side.
I agree.
Yeah, at least they'll be ready for it. And you'll say, okay, what I say is the other side, there's a saying, don't ever underestimate your opponent. Don't lose a battle because you underestimated the opponent. That's why I don't like sometimes these creationists that are just so dismissive and make it seem you're going to have a cakewalk over the evolutionists. They will fight you hard. They're very smart. They're very educated. And you have to be up to their game to be able to defeat them. And you can now. because God has made it possible with what we're discovering. It's becoming a lot easier to defend creationism. And we can talk about that. So we do have a lot. We'll have maybe a show on the history of ID and creationism. We'll talk about theistic evolutionism also. We can talk about abiogenesis, and we can talk about molecular phylogenetics. And basically, you get a little bit of that. My mother loved watching Divorce Court, and some of these shows are a little bit kind of, for lack of a better word, maybe they're a little bit trashy. I don't know, just kind of
Depressing, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. There was, the Maury show. Oh, that's it. The Maury show, where you get this couple and they got the guy and the girl has a baby, and the guy saying, I ain't the daddy, and the girl saying, you the daddy. And at the end of the show, the DNA comes out, and half the time he is, and half the time he's not. And it's really very sordid. Okay. I really should not be, I think it's unfortunate we get sometimes a little bit of entertainment with other people suffering, but that's basically what the show is about. But
You were probably going to make a point about the DNA or the.
Yeah, I was. But how can they establish that? That's molecular phylogeny. See, they could see the similarity in the DNA, and they can decide that, hey, this guy's the daddy because of the similarity. That's molecular phylogeny. So this is why I say don't underestimate the evolutionists, because all they'll do is extrapolate and say, hey, we can do the same thing all the way down to the bacteria, and we can build this family tree.
Well, that's what they are saying. I was just watching that, I think last night.
Yeah.
They're saying that they can prove this stuff. And I'm like, how? And only somebody like you, or who is the microscope guy, is going to be able to take that battle on.
Yeah. The trick is we have to deal with things called taxonomically restricted genes, proteins. And then we deal with cellular architecture, and it's not quite as easy as what you saw on the Maury show. What you saw on the Maury show assumes that the two creatures can mate, or inheritance. One creature can, a human baby comes from human parents.
That's the ticket.
Right. If you assume
that's the underlying assumption.
Right. If you assume that, if you assume that, then the molecular phylogeny is absolutely valid. And so, guys, if you're facing a paternity test, I think if you don't pass that DNA test and the DNA test says you're the daddy, you probably are. Okay. You gotta.
But that same science can't be used to prove that humans and apes are in the same tree.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct. It's a little harder.
Mate.
Right. It's a little harder in that case. It's a little harder. And there's a very fine young lady who is a primatologist. Her name's Erica, otherwise known as Gutsick Gibbon. And I would not debate her on that at this time. I've told her, I said, Erica, one, you and I are friends. I'm not going to debate you on that, because I don't think creationists should be fighting that battle, because I look at the genes between chimpanzees and humans. We have so many genes and proteins and sections of DNA that are 100% identical. Right. So if they're saying we're related, I'm like, the evolutionists will make a good case on those sections of DNA. I tried to tell the creationists, you need a different set of arguments to argue against that. And that's where young Earth creationism is really important. Because if we can show that the Earth is young, then the similarities have to be designed. There's not enough time to evolve it. Even an evolutionist will have to concede that. That's the best way to fight common ancestry between chimps and humans. But there are other.
Wait, I didn't follow that.
Okay. No, okay, we're going to have
Well,
a show.
the argument that Kent always uses, which I actually still agree with, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that just because we're all made with the same Legos doesn't mean that we all grew out of each other.
That is
We could have
correct.
still been built by the creator with the same Legos as an orchard, not a tree.
That is correct. But to make a convincing case, okay, it's one thing to say it's possible. Is different than saying it actually happened that way. Did you ever see I think it was Dumb and Dumber starring Jim Carrey? It was a movie. It's a famous clip where he's asking a girl, Mary, do you think a guy like me and a girl like you have a chance? And she looks at him, gives him that sincere look and says, I don't think, I don't think so. And he said, well, tell me what the odds are, something like that. And she says, like 1 in a million. And then he said, I got a chance. Okay.
So
what Kent said is it's possible that you had chimps and humans independently created, but it's another thing to actually show evidence that we were. And the evidence of that is if the earth is young, we would have to have been created. There would not be enough time to evolve a chimp and a human from a common ancestor in only 10,000 years. I tried to say that's
okay. And that's because if you compare the two anatomies and you see the number of differences that would have had to be changed,
right.
You'd have to change the thumb, you'd have to change the foot, you'd have to change the hair.
Yeah. So we have
and that goes back to another question that the evolutionists are trying to change these days, and that's that they're trying to now say it's not a random process, but at the same time they're saying it's not guided either.
Yeah, so we can cover that, but I would say that there are other gaps that are way more problematic for evolution. One of the biggest, probably the biggest one, is the difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. To argue common ancestry between eukaryotes and prokaryotes is just going to be a disaster for them. You don't hear it raised in debates. I raise it in debates because it's very problematic. And these guys want to argue, well, look at the chimps and humans, look at the fossil record. I say, okay, look at eukaryotes and prokaryotes. They're stumped immediately. And that's what Are you familiar?
Thing Kent always,
yeah, go ahead.
I remember one of them has something in the nucleus, and the other one, I looked this up when I heard Aaron Ra talking about, well, we're all eukaryotes, and therefore we're all related.
Nope, because they're bacteria, they are not eukaryotes. And if Aaron Ra were to debate me on eukaryotes and prokaryotes, I think he'd be challenged. The reason I know that is there's no evolutionary biologist on the planet that can account for this. And I know you did watch my show with Rebecca on, I think it was Cures for Doubting Thomas. I may have showed the topoisomerase and then the nuclear import-export complex. You throw that up there and it's only like a 4-minute video. I've never, they throw in the towel at that point. And they'll say, well, that's something for us to figure out. And I'll say, yeah, right.
They say that about everything.
But the point is, what I'll counter then is I'll say, all right, so you're just taking it by faith. You really don't have a fact. And you've just admitted you don't have the answer. I pointed out why it's statistically improbable, why you would not expect this. And we don't expect a bacteria to become spontaneously a eukaryote that has the membrane-bound organelle. So you alluded to it. One has the nucleus, that's the eukaryote. But it's not just the nucleus, it's that membrane-bound organelle that has all those little gates that open and shut and let only certain things go in and out. And that's a very controlled process. If that breaks down, the cell's dead immediately. pretty much immediate. It's not going to survive very long at the very least. And
Yeah. The
I throw
number
that-
of things that go wrong that will make an organism die is large.
yes, yes. Natural selection can't work on that. And so that's why I say you don't have to argue the fossil record. You show stuff like that, you've at least demonstrated they're accepting that it can evolve on faith. And I'll say at that point, okay, you are professing faith in this, and you can't, not only can you not prove it today, I'm betting you're never going to prove it, because there's no reason statistically in terms of what we know that this can happen. This is the parallel of expecting a 747 to assemble in a junkyard. And you can't.
So that's kind of like what we were saying before about abrupt appearance. If a prokaryote doesn't have that gate wall, and then suddenly the only other thing found in the fossil record is a eukaryote that has that gate wall, which is already complex and not half formed, that's abrupt appearance right there.
Right. So we're probably not going to find it in the fossil record because it's soft. It'd be kind of what we call soft tissue. But even supposing we could, it's a distinct form. And you know, I know why evolutionists would rather have us talk about the fossil record, because then you avoid problems like this. But then we could talk about those 5 transitions from a purely molecular standpoint, like, say, the emergence of plants versus the emergence of multicellular animals, like, say, humans or insects, or the ancestors of humans, whatever they are, chordates, vertebrates, whatever. The evolutionists will know the terms. That's why I don't want to get into that mess, but there has to be distinct cellular change. It's just going to be a mess when you start arguing the cell. It's like, okay, let's not look at the fossil record. Let's look at what would have to happen in terms of the cells. And it starts to become really painful for them. And that's why I've been advocating, argue the cellular biology. I'll tell you why. I mentioned one of the creationists that we should follow is Change Tan. She's been on this channel before, God bless her. She was an atheist or a non-Christian. She's definitely a non-Christian. She grew up in communist China. And she was taught all the standard stuff. She went to the United States, studied at Ivy League schools like University of Pennsylvania. She was a physical organic chemist. She was a professor in these areas. She went on to Harvard to do her postdoc in biological sciences. A Nobel Prize winner by the name of George Smith encouraged her, picked her out, saw that she's talented, and said, you should teach molecular biology. She started teaching molecular biology. And part of teaching molecular biology is to describe the gene replication and transcription and translation between eukaryotes and prokaryotes, because the machinery is different. As she's teaching this to her students, because she had to learn, so first she had to learn it so she could teach it. So she did all this chemistry, but then that qualified her to do the biochemistry and then to teach the cellular biology and then the molecular biology. But to do that, she had to learn this. And as she saw the difference, she said, one can't evolve from the other, or it's unreasonable to think they had a common ancestor. That around that time, she was also, the Lord was moving in her heart. She became a Christian. I don't know which came first, whether she was a Christian first or a creationist first, but it happened all around the same time. But as she was studying the science, she said, there's no way that this could happen without a miracle. She became a creationist at that point. And then that led her to study the origin of life, the abiogenesis problem. And she published the book with Rob Stadler, who I mentioned earlier, Stairway to Life, which I think is
that's why I heard the name.
Yes. That is the reason I encourage Stairway to Life is that's written by someone that teaches it at a secular university. Everything in that book looks very much like the way she teaches molecular biology. If you take her molecular biology course, and I've seen some of the lectures that she gives, and you look at that book, they're almost identical. It's shocking. Now, of course, she'll take it a little further in the book and say this is improbable. But there's a lot of things there that if you get through that book, you've actually gone through a course in molecular biology. And I said, isn't that interesting? You can actually teach creationism by just teaching the science right. So,
Wow. So
yeah.
this is different than like signature of the cell.
Yes.
I'll
I'll tell you, yes.
Inside of the cell, which we think of as really small, but the molecules are actually what comprise the cell, and they're even smaller. Is that how this is working?
Yes.
Wow.
So now the book Signature of the Cell is written more for a popular audience, but even then it's very technical. I happen to have it, an autographed copy. It's written by Stephen Meyer. He knows who I am. It was really funny. He was doing a book signing and I came up and I said, I'm Salvador Cordova. And he goes, oh, you're Sal. And I was like, oh, I was very, very flattered that he would know who I am because everyone knows who he is. But the Stairway to Life is taught by, the reason I like the Signature of the Cell, not to take anything away from it, but Stairway to Life would probably, most of that book would fit in a secular college, because most of what's taught is actually classroom textbook stuff, but it gives you just that 5 to 10% that say, hey, look at this from just a little different perspective, and you'll see that this doesn't naturally evolve.
Same data, different interpretation.
Right. And she argues it very well. And the amazing thing, she does not, I know creationists want to start with the Bible as the starting point, as the worldview. And that's not actually the way Jesus teaches. Did you know that? Jesus said,
I did not.
Jesus said in John 10:38, if you do not believe my words, believe the works. So he's acknowledging you could be in a worldview, you can have a worldview situation where you don't believe Jesus' words at all. But let's say you have some inclination you want to believe. Jesus says, study the works that you may know.
Which means miracles.
Yes. And that's
what you were saying about a prokaryote and a eukaryote. Don't the evolutionists also agree that they are two distinct trees, or do they think that they are one trunk with two branches?
Well, the way to argue this is whatever way that they say, okay, let's say it's, it descended from a common ancestor. Okay, one scenario is the prokaryote evolved, a eukaryote came from a prokaryote. And then they have some things like endosymbiosis where a prokaryote got into the new eukaryote. It's a real mess. But I say, I'll grant whatever scenario you want, that what came from what. How do you account for those membrane-bound organelles without a miracle happening? Because as you articulated, the thing's going to be dead. Natural selection can't act on something that's dead. If you have a half-formed membrane that doesn't have those gates where there can be import and export through the channels, the cell's going to die. And they can't resolve that. So all they'll do is they'll do kind of the common, the ancestry.com thing and say, well, they have similar genes, so therefore they had a common ancestor. I say, okay, grant that you have a common ancestor. It's going to take a miracle to make one from the other. And, I'll say, okay, just think about, look at a giraffe and a blade of grass. Are you saying they had a common ancestor?
Well, now you're sounding like Kent.
Yeah.
But it's true. If we all do come down to the same branch, that would mean that plants and mammals had a common ancestor.
Yeah. So Kent gets a few things right. Absolutely. But to teach this well is, if you can get into the cellular details, you can actually make the case really strong, and it will hold up in a university environment. And Change Tan's book with Rob Stadler is an example that will hold.
I get that.
Yeah, it'll hold in a secular university, because that's 90% textbook science, and Rob and Change will just say, okay, I've given you all the textbook science. Why don't you think about it now? What does that mean? What is it telling you? Is it telling
So
you that this?
essentially,
No.
what you're saying is that a prokaryote and a eukaryote are like a different seed. And just like a watermelon seed will not bring forth an apricot seed is fundamentally different than a watermelon seed.
Right. But the
So
difference
what you're
is
saying is a prokaryote and a eukaryote are fundamentally
different architectures.
inextricably, they cannot be. They are just always different, always were.
Yes.
Which means
Or
they
if you,
appeared abruptly in a pre-designed fashion.
exactly. Or let's say we just grant them that they're common ancestors. Can you build one? Can you build it without a miracle along the way? And I'd say no. And I can the difference is rather than asserting it, we can show it. So when I showed that video, the topoisomerase, and then talking about the nuclear localization signal and the import export mechanism, and this is only done in about less than 10 minutes of videos. And see, the thing is, we have animations now that can show this, and when they see it, they're like, oh, that's just another thing we need to solve. And I'm just like, yeah, right. You know, it's a problem.
So the animations are based on what you actually see in a electron microscope.
They're based on not just electron microscopes, but there are all sorts of other things that they do that the cellular biologists and molecular biologists do. I'm not familiar with all their methods. And we have now this new brand of biologists called the structural biologists. And they use all this fancy, like cryo-electron microscopy and X-ray crystallography and, oh boy, just all sorts of things. And
but it's actual imaging. They're not just making this up, because when you see some of those cartoons where it shows they actually look like little robots going down this DNA strand, looking for mutations that need to be corrected. I mean, it looks surreal.
Now at the
and
molecular,
that's why I'm asking if it's
these are
actually
good questions. I don't think they can isolate. They've had to actually reconstruct that. That has to be conceptual. But we do see, like the nuclei in eukaryotes, like the onion. Dr. Sanford, my boss and my colleague now, first genetic or transgenic organism he created using his gene gun process was an onion, because it has very big genome, and you can actually see it, I think, under a strong microscope, but you didn't need anything as maybe as powerful as an electron microscope. But it could be seen that the architecture of that eukaryote is very different than a prokaryote. The other thing is, I think prokaryotes are like 100 times smaller than a eukaryote. It's a gigantic difference. The eukaryote is just massive in general as a cell compared to the prokaryote. So there's a huge size difference. So like I think just comparing the genome, like say E. coli, about 5 million base pairs of DNA, and the human genome is 3.3 billion. So if you just take the cells in terms of the sizes, in general, that's one. And so there's a book by Bruce Alberts and others called Essential Cell Biology. That's where I studied. That's the book I studied from. It's a wonderful book. You can get the first 80 pages downloaded for free through Amazon Kindle, because they like to send out samples so you can, sample it, and you can get a really good education. There's some earlier versions of his other works that are really hard to read, but they're available for free. But back to your question, do we actually see this? The answer is yes. Short answer is yes. And if you debated an evolutionist or any biologist about this, you're not going to get any disagreement, because what I've just described is accepted textbook biology.
Now, just to clarify, a eukaryote and a prokaryote, for some reason I was thinking those were single cell organisms, but now I'm hearing you, it's actually what our bodies are comprised of.
Okay, so we have there are eukaryotes that are single celled, almost all multicellular organisms that I know of are eukaryotic. Eukaryotes
Which
have all,
means that their cells have the nuclear wall.
yes, plus a lot of other things, a lot of other
Right.
really cool things. And we could show diagrams of that. So this would be worth an entire talk, because see, we can make assertions, but it's good if we can say, okay, go a little deeper. And at least if we're equipping the students, it's helpful if we can at least say, go to this resource. So like,
Yeah, I think you need to link all the things that you have spoken of so far in the
Yeah.
description.
So I may not be able to do it in this show, but in our subsequent shows, because like, let's say they're going off to school and learning biology, and they're told in their textbook, life emerged this way or that way. I would link them to the book Stairway to Life, and then James Tour's talk on this. James Tour is a famous chemist. And I can tell you that, they can go, if they have any openness to creationism, and they go through biochemistry and organic chemistry, biochemistry, cellular biology, and they see this, it'll actually strengthen their faith.
Okay, now I'm thinking about the Lego thing. It sounds like the eukaryotic cell is the Lego block that most things are created from.
Most multicellular. There are some eukaryotes that are single-celled, like chanoflagellates or something. There are other ones I don't know it off the top of my head, because I tend to study human biology.
Yeah, but the point would be
building
that
block.
the atheist is going to, and that this is what I've heard Aaron Ross say.
Yeah.
Since we are all eukaryotes and we're all built with the same Legos, therefore we are all from the same branch.
And what I will say in response to Aaron Ra, let's assume that we did evolve. Let's assume we came from a common ancestor. You need miracles to make that work.
Mm-hmm.
I'll grant you,
Pre-designed and engineered miracles.
You would need engineered miracles.
Not random. Not random. Okay, now instead of one arm, you have two arms. No, it's pre-designed and engineered.
It would have to be, or you could accept special. But then at that point, I said, okay, if it can't be random or natural, how is that really different than any other form of creationism? Maybe you might be a progressive creationist, and there are people, like you mentioned the word signature in the cell. There's a book, Signature in the Cell, by Stephen Meyer. Stephen Meyer is not a young earth creationist. He would be classified as a progressive creationist, because he realizes there have to be miracles along the way. And he wrote a book that was very critical of evolution called Darwin's Doubt, that specifically followed the Cambrian explosion. And he was talking about all the different cell types. So the first major division of classes of cells is eukaryote, prokaryote, or prokaryote, eukaryote. Now the eukaryotic cell in the human being then diversifies into different cell types. So when there's an embryo or a zygote, that thing will start to diversify into different kinds of cells. So a blood cell is different than a skin cell, and it's different from a bone cell or a liver cell, or the cells in your eyes, the cells in your hair. And
I've heard that.
Oh, they're depending on the classification scheme, you'll have like 300 to thousands of cell types. It depends, that's kind of an arbitrary thing how we classify. But a nerve, if you see the nerve cells, and I've taken a class in neuroscience, there are all these varieties of nerve cells. And I had to take an exam, and I said, the diagram, like one looked like a chandelier, and I'm embarrassed now because they had all these other kinds of nerve cells you're supposed to recognize and identify. And there are all these different kinds of nerve cells in the brain and in the nervous system. So,
and they just pop out of a zygote?
They develop, the proper word is develop out of the
Well,
zygote.
I know, but a zygote doesn't have all of those in it. They come, they grow, they
They
develop.
yes, somehow God designed the machinery so that as the cell is differentiating, and I have slides of like the process, it's immoral to do this to a human. So they do this with like worms, like nematodes and roundworms, and you'll see the staining. So you'll see the cell develop from the zygote, and then they start to identify little pieces. And even after very early on, even like less than say a few hundred cells, you can actually start to identify the sex cells where, like for the human, if it's a female, she starts to develop, cells that will become the eggs or something like that in her reproductive process. And then the cells for the males that'll lead to his reproductive process. I didn't get all the details quite right. The biologist probably straightened me out on that, but that's generally, you begin to see that early in development. And so like the heart cells are myocytes. They have a different architecture than other cells. And so it's just amazing that you see, when you actually see like these pictures of the zygote developing into like the fetus, it's very powerful because you get to see how the cells start to differentiate. That's the process of differentiation. And only eukaryotes can handle that level of complexity. You think about that we're built with like 100 trillion cells, and so many of them are very different from each other, and that has to all unfold from just that one little zygote, that embryo. It's amazing.
Well, I think that's what they would say illustrates all coming from a simple cell or a simple, what do they call it? Darwin had a strange word for what we would now call a simple life form, like a mower. I can't remember what he called it. But since it's all coming from a zygote, that does make it seem like you could get a different, we do actually witness that the different cell types all come from one parent cell type.
And it was Haeckel who said phylogeny
Recapitulates.
Ontogeny.
Yeah.
Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. The problem with that is the differentiation in the, like say from the zygote to an adult human, it's all by programming. Because if that program's disrupted, you get birth defects. It's predictable.
Well, and I wasn't referring to the actual fetus development. I was referring to what you were describing, how from the lump of cells that we call a zygote comes all the other kinds of cells.
Yeah. So this is actually, I could tell this is going to be worth another whole nother discussion. And so you're actually helping me put together all the episodes we might talk about.
Yay.
And you could
I want to share a revelation that I had, and you tell me if it's cool or not. I thought it was really cool. We're talking about cells and genes and how that is like a seed. A certain gene is only going to produce a certain creature, just like a seed will only produce a certain tree.
That's not quite correct.
Okay.
And we'll have to cover that too.
Okay.
The reason I'll tell you that we have to be careful about that, I've looked in, that's one reason, for better or worse, we can do genetic engineering where we take the genes in one creature and put them in another. They're similar enough, and in some cases they're identical. I know that, like, for example, the COX-1 gene, the protein that it codes for, 100% identical in a human and a chimp. You could take the human COX-1 and put it in a chimp, or vice versa, which would be really gross.
Oh.
And you should develop the same. Now, we have taken human, I know these experiments, we've taken human topoisomerases both topoisomerase 2 alpha and 2 beta and put it in yeast, and the yeast will live. So it's not quite, there are parts you
Okay.
can mix.
Well, let
mix and
me
match.
see if I can finish my
Go ahead, finish your
my
thought.
my revelation, and you tell me if it's cool or not. So you were talking about the why going all the way back to Adam or Noah, Noah.
Noah.
And that would be called a gene, wouldn't it?
A chromosome contains the DNA, and in that long stretch of DNA, about 2% are the genes. The other 98% are not non-coding, and we're still figuring out what the non-coding does. Big arguments over that. My work for Dr. Sanford studied the non-coding DNA.
Well, the thing that I thought was a cool revelation was the word gene is in the word Genesis.
Yes.
And so is abiogenesis.
Yes.
So is the word generator. Generator creates power. So it's like going back to the beginning. The beginning had to be a why, an engineered, designed, supernaturally, miraculously popped into existence out of nothing beginning.
I believe that. I can't totally defend it in this show, but yes. By the way,
isn't that cool though that the word gene and the word Genesis?
Yeah. Now, just I don't mean to burst your bubble, but it's widely believed that it was Darwin who invented the word gene.
Go ahead, take the needle.
I'm sorry. Sorry to burst your bubble. And it may have been because he took it from the idea of, the genesis of things. And then hence we get the word also genetics. But so Darwin may have appealed to a Christian idea.
That was the other thing I was thinking about. You started the show by saying that Darwin actually used the word creator. And I was thinking, I wonder if he did that just to appeal to his predominantly Christian culture at the time so that he wouldn't appear like so much of an outcast.
I believe, yes, I think that is credible. And also he had a Christian wife. Oh my goodness. The wife probably just was agonizing that Darwin was going the way he was going. And she needs to be canonized because she stuck with him. She took a vow, married that.
Did she?
Yeah, she took a vow, marriage vow, and she stuck with him.
No, I know, but she stuck with him his whole life.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's probably is praying for him, and so he may have done that also. He may have had personal pressure. So that's why I was saying he actually had two theories: one, the warm pond, and then the one in Origin of Species, where he said created. So I think what you said is probably more in line. He probably believed in his heart the warm pond theory, but he wanted to appease people and use the word created. But he wrote what he wrote.
The warm pond, huh?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry too.
I missed what you said.
I wanted to hear what you said too. I'm sorry. I was going to say the warm pond theory can be tested. Hello?
Yeah.
You can make a warm pond any place you want to. It's not going to make life.
Well, the funny thing is you could take a frog, put him in a blender, right? Pour him out in a warm pond.
That's another good Kent Hovinism. You have
That's
all
a good one,
ingredients.
actually.
Yes,
so
it is.
We'll give credit where credit is due. But you see, it has to be followed through with substance. You see, the instinct is there. It's good it's good theater. Okay, he's really good at theater. But I'm trying to fill in. Okay, that's not going to carry you in a university, because as you said, like they're going to laugh at you. But when you actually start to show that you understand this, they back down quick.
Well, Sal, the thing I'm noticing, I mean, I'm getting shunned for being with atheists on the internet, but what I'm noticing is a lot of these atheists were raised on Kent Hovind. And when they went to college is when they lost their faith.
There you have it. See, you've made my case right there. I said, this is why you need to teach the creationism a little bit more solidly. And you can't have this attitude and say, oh, look, they're so stupid. And they walk away thinking, oh, this is going to be easy. I got to tell, I want to tell these guys, I want to tell the creationists, you go off to school, this is not a playground. It's going to be war. It's going to be intellectual war. You got to be up for it. Don't think that you could just do this frog in the blender and think you're going to win. You got to study hard.
Not only that, but
Mm.
by calling things stupid
Yeah.
or moron or all that junk that Kent Hovind does, it negates the fact that if a student has questions, they're probably pointing him in a really good direction. Have you ever had it happen where you have this question and it takes you a really long time and you figure, oh, well, it's a dumb question. But then when you finally get the answer, you go, oh, wow, that had a big, huge nugget in it.
Yeah.
And we don't want our students to be ashamed to ask questions.
Exactly.
We don't want them to be called stupid or morons for wondering things, because that's what we're,
And the thing is I nearly got driven out of the church because I asked those questions. Sometimes the atheists will ask pointed questions, and if what was happening to me is they're saying, oh, you're sinning. Well, okay, maybe I am, but you still didn't answer my question. And
that's ridiculous.
Well, I nearly got thrown out, and guess the kind of people I was dealing with.
If our faith is based on reality, which we believe it is, then no question is sin, because the answer to any question is going to be founded in truth and reality.
Right. You see, what I found is a lot of churches have the model of being kind of cultish. I'm sorry to say that. That's the harsh truth. That's why some of our churches are failing, is their business model is, oh, let's just insulate the youth and the people from tough questions. We can kind of keep them under our,
just follow the leader.
Yeah, follow the leader. Difficult questions, and I'm going through this now in the church I'm a part of. It's like, oh, so I'm asking questions about finances. I'm comparing them to attendance numbers. And right now that's, I got thrown out of the church for that. I'm just like, all I was doing is counting the attendance numbers and saying, gee, it looked like we lost 80% under the current leadership, and that's not good. And I began to see this culture that the model wasn't about facts, it's about control and closing minds and insulating people and manipulating them. You see, that will, sadly, what happens is they'll go and say, we're proclaim, look at all the people, look at how many numbers we're filling the church with to praise the Lord on Sunday. But it's fundamentally not built on facts and God's spirit. It's built on manipulation and control, and sometimes deception. And there's conning, a lot of con artistry. We saw that. We don't need to go into all the examples. It's not built on faith. And it was one of the sobering things that I found out when I said, why don't I teach more creationism in the churches? I offered my and I was a paid researcher. I couldn't believe how all the doors that were shut in my face. It's like, why don't you want to equip the young with how to defend their faith? It's, no, we'll just teach more of the Bible. We'll just teach, just read the scriptures to them. That'll set them. I'm just like, that's not even what the Bible teaches. Look at John 10:38. Look at Acts 17.
Consider the lilies.
Exactly.
Wow, Sal.
Yeah.
That's why you related to my story, because you saw the same cult-like behavior in your church that was all about control. And you're pointing the finger not to the Lord, but to the
person
leader.
wanting money, wanting control,
Oh,
prestige.
you made me have a hot flash and like a, sometimes when I get really upset and really, it's kind of like having a flashback of being in that environment where you're shamed and manipulated and controlled and lied to.
Yeah.
It
It's
does
amazing what-
cause an emotional response.
Yeah. You know, it's beautiful though. You're still a professing Christian after all of this. But there are a lot of people that have lost their faith once they kind of get disillusioned in their leader. And that's why teaching creationism the right way, independent of the personality, is very important to me, because whether I fail or anyone else fails them, the works of the Lord testify of him, and they can hold on to that. I tell you, with what happened with Ravi Zacharias, and I used to rate his sermons the number one. I would share it with my mom. When I heard what all came down, I said, you know what? I can still accept that the message was correct. To what extent?
That was one of my first things that I said at the end of my interview with AJ, was the message and the man are separate.
Yeah.
Take the good and leave the rest.
Yeah, because it's just, and I'm really, it's hard for me to say this, but there are times we know that we've said something correct and we don't follow it ourselves. Kind of even on a lower scale. Like, I'll tell people what they should do for their diet and exercise, and I don't follow it. Okay. So I could see that someone like Ravi Zacharias can give you the right message, but he doesn't follow it himself. I can see that kind of reflected on a smaller scale with me, although I didn't do all the heinous things that he did. Thank God.
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental difference. I mean, they say that there are not grade levels of sin, but I think there are, because telling somebody not to eat chocolate and then eating chocolate is a whole different story than telling somebody don't lie and lying 50 times a day.
Yeah,
Or,
absolutely. Absolutely.
you know, thou shalt not commit adultery or whatever.
Yeah.
But you're right, though. I mean, we are told that we are supposed to first take the plank out of our own eye.
So anyway, I found out the hard way that sadly a lot of Christianity, at least in the modern day in the United States, has been built around personalities. And I think God is allowing these personalities to be revealed, who they are and what they're
Shake them
about.
up, Lord.
And yeah, a lot of people are losing their faith in the process. And maybe this has to be done. Maybe people just have to go back to the basics and say, okay, what did the Bible say? And why do I believe it? Independent of my local pastor or someone I looked up to. Because
Wow, that would be good if it sent people to the Bible to look for the truth.
yeah. And
what does the Bible teach?
You know how I returned to the faith when I nearly left. I'd say I had bouts of agnosticism. I never went so far to say that there's no God, because that would be just absurd to me. Because you just think about the complexity of life and the universe. It's just like, yeah, this can't be a mindless accident. You have all the trouble. But it was during that bouts of agnosticism about 20 years ago, I was hanging out with the atheists. I felt this is great, just hanging out with them, because unlike church where you're shamed, you're persecuted for asking tough questions, here you're welcomed. And I loved the community for a while. And then I asked the question, I said, okay, this is great. I love this community. How do you know what's right and wrong? And what do you live for? Silence. At that point, I said, okay, guys, nothing personal against you, but I'm going to take what little scraps of faith I have and go back to Christianity, because at least there's a chance that I'll find meaning and purpose, and there might be eternal life. If you guys are right, there's nothing for me at all anyway. as it says in 1 Corinthians 15, if the dead are not raised, Christ is not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And I said, yeah, that would be the kind of atheist I would be. I said, if I subscribe to what you guys believe, all I would live for is just to let my heart beat a little longer, because that's all I could live for. You can't demonstrate to me that there's anything more to life than just that, just trying to alleviate what little local pain I have today. There's not some higher purpose. That's the kind of atheist I would have become. And I said, that's not for me. Not at all. Maybe for you.
Well,
yeah, I
that's
couldn't.
kind of interesting, because if I didn't believe in a judgment, I would do bad things.
Yeah.
My
you don't have to-
anger
Yeah.
would take me places where it shouldn't, and the level of pain would, I mean, I'd want to kill myself.
So what has Jesus done for you that has gotten you through what you've been through, especially the last few years? Has it been
He
a source
says
of
that he's the God of my life.
Mhm.
I am not the master of my life to be able to take it when I want to, or to be able to take somebody else's. That's him. It's only his hand that tells me that. And I think it's interesting that the atheists seem to know that kind of right and wrong, at least the ones that I've been dealing with. Maybe they're all different, but they have a stronger moral compass than the church has had in standing up for my defense.
Amen.
And
Amen.
standing against, you know, what you were describing, that in the church.
Yes, amen.
So I don't know where they get it, if they don't believe in a God or a judgment.
Well, I think sometimes it's just like in the Old Testament. Sometimes God would be saying, hey, look, sometimes the unbelievers did better than you. And in some of the prophecies against Israel,
That's
he said,
true.
you were worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's pretty bad.
That's true. Remember
Yeah.
that thing in Corinthians where the guy was having sex with his father's wife or something, and Paul said, even the heathen don't do that.
Exactly. And so sometimes God lets that happen and say, just to kind of just shock the church and say, you see how bad you're behaving? Not even the heathen behave that low.
I agree.
I mean, okay,
I agree.
I invite the
find it-
viewers to go to Cindy's channel to hear that I got upset when I heard that her life had been threatened by someone that she has a legal case with right now. And, that bothers me. That bothers me. And we could have.
Yeah, actually, I recently did an interview with some people that AJ told me about, Atheist Junior. Their names are Amy and James, and I think it's a primarily atheist channel, although they might just call themselves skeptics. But anyway, I talked about that in the interview, and she had a baseball bat to pretend something about a mafia. It's mafia.
Okay.
I mean, you were talking about control and cult-like behavior and manipulation and deception and con. I don't know if it went so far as that you would call it mafia behavior, but I did. I have used that word.
Well, social structures are very powerful. There's a guy in my church. He used to hang out with the Hells Angels. Okay, he's a tough, he's a rough dude. I love him to death. He's a brother in Christ now. Lord's transformed him, but he was relating all the stories. He said, yeah, you know what? When the Hells Angels would meet, they'd have their big meetings. They'd call it church. So the social structure is very powerful influence on us and how we, it gives a lot of meaning in the way we conduct ourselves. Even in the mafia, there's that brotherhood. and there's honor, which is kind of strange that this criminal enterprise, but the reason they're so effective is when you gave your word to your mafia boss, that was like sacred, kind of religious. And so these social structures are very powerful in perpetuating and enforcing behavior and what you live by and how you live your life. It's incredible.
It's
And so,
enraging. It's enraging. It's inappropriate to exercise that kind of control over another person that the Lord made to be free.
yeah. Well, it was meant for good. And like a lot of things, something that was meant for good ends up being evil. So if you think about the first social structure, it's just a family. So if you expect the mother and father to raise the kids in the Lord commands it. But then let's say it's an unbelieving family. You're going to make some Muslim terrorists, but the family unit was meant to raise up the children in the right way, but then it can be misused. And so you can expand the family unit and it goes into larger and larger units that can be totally misused. And so what can happen then is these cults, and even if their theology is reasonably right, they can still be a personality cult. And it's not restricted to being in churches. You could have like these motorcycle gangs. And actually, that's another thing. There are lots of gangs in the United States.
That's what I was thinking. It's just like school peer pressure. It's just like peer pressure at school. You're either a jock or you're a burnout or you're whatever, and you don't go outside those little lines.
So a lot of people don't realize that in church, what they may be professing is not really what they really believe. It's just they're just going along with the crowd. And sometimes it takes a lot of stress in life where your faith is really tested, and you'll see whether it is really grounded in truth, or is it just something that was socialized or brainwashed into you. And 20 years ago, I was like, okay, I'm ready to go, Lord. You got to help me out, because a lot of it's just been socialized in me. Is there any shred of facts? And so I hung out with the atheists and I debated them, politely argued with them. The process of them not being able to answer my tough questions. See, I asked the tough questions of the Christians and I nearly left. I started asking hard questions of the atheist. That sent me back. It wasn't quite a prodigal son situation, but I got a taste of what they had. And I said, I don't want it. I don't want it.
You want part of it, but not that part of it.
Exactly. I said, I love the skepticism, but I said, I didn't like the meaninglessness. I didn't like the idea, if there's no God, Christ wasn't raised, then let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And I said, no, life deep in my heart, I said, that just doesn't seem right. When as Jesus said, yeah.
When you're talking about being constrained to stay within a certain line dictated by a family or a mob or a cult or like a Hell's Angel gang, I wouldn't mind being constrained by lines by the Father God. And I think that's what the atheists might say as they listen to us, that, well, that's what the Bible does. It constrains you into exactly what you're saying. But actually, that's what I was saying in terms of it constrains me from not allowing my anger to do something sinful, not killing myself because the pain is too great. Yeah. So that kind of constraint from a good God is good.
Yes. One thing that atheists, I've talked to atheists, I said, would you rather live, okay, if you take, not all of them will say yes, but a few of them will say yes. Some of them have said, I'd rather live among loving Christians than some of these other atheists. If you've looked at some of the atheist blog wars, like Elevator Gate, and you see the atheists just ripping into each other, it's, from a Christian standpoint, it was actually kind of comical. Or this
I've
big
only
fight
seen
between,
the kind of hate mail that you get in the comment section sometimes, and wow.
I mean, there's
And
like,
actually, when I watched your debate with Matt Dillahunty, I saw that
Yeah.
he was ripping into you, and I'm like, wow.
you should see these guys rip into each other. And there was like, I think lawsuits probably in the millions in lawyer fees between PZ Myers and Richard Carrier. And these are two atheists going after it. I'm just like, thank God that they're picking on each other, because I wouldn't want Christians getting involved in that between an atheist.
You wouldn't want an enemy like that.
No. So it was actually
Well,
kind of like
they
comforting.
mocked us for attacking, for Christians attacking Christians. I didn't know they had the atheists attacking atheists.
Oh, it was
too.
vicious. So we can actually have a show on Elevator Gate. I'm going to put that Elevator Gate. It's almost comical. There was a huge. It's very educational to see what happens when people are not constrained by a higher power and they just go off on what they want. But we see it kind of even like now with the feminist atheists fighting against the transgender atheists. It's Looney Tunes land. It's
Wow, I haven't seen any of that either.
Oh yeah. But why do I bring this up? When you see how people start to live their lives out, when they declare that they've gotten free of Christianity, they have no basis for what's right and wrong. And so you have the feminists fighting the transgender people. And it's like, well, who's right? Who's right? How do you decide who's right? Because if there's no God, the only thing you have to appeal to is what you think. Whatever floats your boat, whatever makes you feel good. And so, for example, some of the feminists are very upset that guys are saying that they can just declare women. And so some of the feminists are saying, no, that's not right. You're either a woman or you're not. And they took offense, understandably, like, for example, these guys going into female sports. And it's like, no, that's not right. So we won't get into that too much because I don't want to get banned from YouTube for delving into that. But I'm just saying it was amazing that the atheists could not agree on what's right and wrong, except they can only appeal to their own whims. And it's like, so you have no basis to say one thing's right or the other, except you just don't like it. And how do you know that your likes and dislikes constitute what's ultimately right?
Better than anybody else's likes and dislikes.
Right. I said, this isn't something in deep in my heart said, no, that just doesn't resonate with me. The other thing is, if we are created, the creator has the privilege to say how we should conduct our lives. And that resonated with me.
And I think that is received as controlling or negative in some way when we miss the fact that it's because he knows what's best for us, because he made us. It's like the manufacturer of the car knows the oil that's best to run in that engine, and he knows what's best for us, and his motive is not control. And when we think about him wanting to be worshiped, that would seem almost like a cult leader too. Oh, well, he just wants to be worshiped. But it's fundamentally different with God, because he's good. And if you're not worshiping him, then you are not appreciating good. You're failing to see that his motive is love, not control. And the fact that he even gives us freedom shows love. I mean, I remember with my daughter when she was growing up, yes, you have to discipline, but I felt like one of my greatest acts of love that I could demonstrate to her was giving her freedom to choose. I would explain things to her, but then I would say, now, honey, you get to make the decision. You know, mommy can't force her will on you. And I think our Father God is like that too.
Yes, true love can't be forced on someone.
Right.
Yes, it's not true love. And the Lord gave freedom in the Garden of Eden. And for those who watch this channel, I gave a show on a faint heart, never want to fear a maiden. And I covered a little bit of that, and I will cover other shows where I talk about why did God create Eden and then let the devil make his sales pitch to Adam and Eve. He could have chosen not to let that snake in the garden at all. And the goal for that.
Or not to make the tree.
Right. Exactly. If you go to Deuteronomy 13, there's a picture of this where God says, you know, you're going to go into the promised land, but I'm going to let false prophets wander in there, which is like kind of shocking. It's like, God, why don't you keep them out? Then they won't sin. But God says, I'm letting them go there because I'm testing to see whether you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. And in a
Are
sense,
you kidding me?
yeah, that's Deuteronomy 13, 1-4.
False prophets are to test us?
Yeah, look
Somebody
at,
just last night, I was texting with somebody, basically, you know, given my violin story. And she said, Cindi, false prophets are given to test us to see if we'll follow him or follow man.
amen.
And I thought she was just like giving me this, like placating, you know, Christianese kind of thing.
Yeah.
But now listening to you say that, I'm like, I think I better look that up.
Deuteronomy
13.
Yeah, Deuteronomy 13, verses 1-3 or 1-4. And it makes sense of a lot of things. And I know, given what you've been through, the Lord God is testing to see whether you'll love him with all your heart and all your soul. I'm very grateful you're still a Christian after all this. Praise the Lord.
Well,
What you went
Jesus
through
is
could
still
have destroyed
Jesus,
your
even
faith.
though there's creeps in the world.
Yeah.
But it's still heartbreaking and devastating to
Absolutely.
be betrayed like that.
But, you know, maybe that's one little grain of comfort that you can gather through all this, is this was in God's plan. And I thank the Lord that your faith is held. May he
That's
grant,
what she was telling me, that it's part of God's plan. I'm like,
it's pretty harsh.
what? She said,
It's
it
pretty
has to be this
harsh.
way.
It's
Yeah,
now, can I give you some comfort?
yeah.
There's a psalm that says, it's good that I was afflicted that I may know your law. It's somewhere in Psalm 119. I mean, that's kind of tough
Wow.
medicine. It was good that I was afflicted that I may know your law. And
Sorry.
yeah.
Oh, comic relief.
Comic relief. And I don't like quoting that because that applies to me too, because I'm going to probably in for some tough medicine myself, all of us. And I was sharing with someone, I said, I am writing a series of books on romance. And I had my first installment like last week that tries to teach the gospel through stories of historical love stories and archetypal. And the first love story I covered was that of my mother and father. And I was teaching
Yeah, I
the
listened
gospel.
to that.
Yeah,
And it was
thank you.
very, very, I left a comment in there because it lifts up true love, nobility, honor, all those good things
Oh, thank you.
that we are supposed to have as our role models, not what I've experienced.
And all that proceeds from Christ. Every good gift comes from above.
Yeah.
But I was gonna, I was serious, but I was halfway joking. I said I could summarize my views for Christian singleness, marriage, dating, courtship, family in half a Bible verse. It says, many are the afflictions of the righteous.
And
And
the Lord delivereth
him from them all. You forgot the second part.
Oh yeah, the young lady kind of chided me. She said, "But you forgot the rest." But my point was, I said, look at William Carey, that missionary who had the wife that had, mental issues.
Mhm.
He was afflicted. So my comforting verse is 2 Corinthians 4:17. For this momentary light affliction is building for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. And so, Cindi, everything you've gone through, the Lord promises that the way you'll get the ultimate restitution by his grace is that however bad it's been for you now, heaven, the next
I
life
have
will be,
paradise to look forward to.
and it's going to be, how good would it have to be to make up for what you've been through? It'd have to be pretty
Well,
good, wouldn't it?
part of my vision for that is that I will not have any physical, like remember earlier when you gave me a hot flash, I won't have any physical manifestations about the pain anymore.
Yeah.
Either I won't remember it or maybe I'll remember it, but I don't know.
But in a way that
But it
you'll
does,
say, I'm
it
free and
does
safe now.
exactly.
Yeah.
I'm safe now.
It's
Nothing can ever harm me again. No one will ever lie to me again.
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
So, now I wanted to say, see, I'm glad I was trying to encourage you. I know you want to talk about all the bad and that happened to you. And I said, I wanted you to focus. I wanted both of us really to focus on the evidence and to focus on Jesus, because if we focus on our Lord and Savior and we talk about him, there's really not much that can be said to criticize what we've said among the Christians. And I feel we've done that today. And I think we'll have more topics to talk about in the future. And I think maybe on the note of 2 Corinthians 4:17, this momentary light affliction is building for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. That's probably a good note to end on. I'm going to give you the last word, and we'll look forward to our next installment. But go ahead, Cindi. Say what the Lord has put on your heart.
I enjoyed talking about the science very much as well. And I'm glad that it wasn't just a gripe session. Sometimes you need to get it out, but I enjoyed what we did instead. And I liked what you said about fixing your eyes on Jesus. And it reminded me of a song Twyla Paris did in the 80s called Fix Your Eyes on Jesus. And it's a very beautiful song. You should put a link in it. And don't forget all your other links that you promised you would put in.
I haven't heard Twyla Paris' name in a long time.
I know.
You inspired me to go listen to that. She was one of my favorite artists, and
Yep.
it inspired me. So if
Let's
I miss
pray.
some of the if I have some missing links, God willing, it'll be in our future shows, and we'll cover that. I'd like to thank all the viewers for joining us today, and joining Cindi and I today as we turn our eyes upon Jesus. I look forward to joining Cindi and the audience in the future. Take care, and the Lord richly bless you.
God bless you. Bye-bye.